They called her the Quiet One. That's all anyone at Cedar Creek Medical needed to know. They didn't know she'd once commanded a combat surgical team. They didn't know that the hands folding linen with hospital corners too perfect for civilian training had tied arterial clamps under mortar fire. The legend called Valkyrie, the one who'd kept 14 Marines alive through a siege that killed everyone else, she walked Cedar Creek's ICU like smoke, visible only when you needed to see her. It was Tuesday, 0600 hours, when everything changed. A Marine general was coming. And the only person who knew why was the nurse no one suspected. The fluorescent lights hum in that frequency that live somewhere between a whisper and a scream. Antiseptic burn. Rubber gloves snapping like punctuation marks. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm in bay for while monitors beeped their steady percussion, beep, 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 the soundtrack of lives held in suspension between recovery and the alternative. Brooke Sullivan moved through Cedar Creek Medical's ICU at 0615 before the chaos of shift change could anchor her in place. She preferred the quiet hours, the ones where the only witness to her competence was the equipment itself and occasionally a nurse who'd learned not to ask questions about how she always knew what came next. Bay 2 had a post-op cardiac patient, 67 years old, ejection fraction dropping. She checked the lines with movements so practiced they looked like meditation, adjusting the flow, reading the monitor, her fingers steady as surgical steel as she recorded vitals in the chart. The attending physician would notice the entries later, impressed by the precision. The detail. The way the notes read like a combat medic's field report, time stamped to the minute, observation sparse and absolute, no wasted words. She didn't think about why she documented that way. Thinking was a luxury the Marines had trained out of her. Inside her jacket lining, folded against the fabric where no one would see it unless they looked for it, was a faded unit patch. 2nd Marine Expeditionary Force, Kandahar. The edges had worn soft from being touched. She reached for it sometimes during her breaks, a talisman, though talismans were superstition and Captain Brooke Sullivan didn't believe in superstition anymore. She believed in protocol. In precision. In making herself indispensable without ever drawing the kind of attention that got people killed. At 0730, Dr. Pierce arrived for morning rounds. He was the type of man whose name sounded like old money, which it wasn't, but he'd spent 14 years perfecting the voice of someone who'd never been told no. Tall. Tailored white coat pressed hard enough to cut. He moved through the ICU like he owned it, because in every way that mattered to him, he did. Chief of ICU at Cedar Creek. 3 published papers. Board member connections. The kind of man who believed his credentials were prophecy. He didn't notice Brooke at first. She was designed not to be noticed, moving between bays with the kind of institutional invisibility that only came from understanding that the hospital belonged to doctors the way ships belong to captains, and nurses belong to no one. But during morning handoff, during the transition from night shift to day, something happened that made him look at her directly for the first time. The pharmacy resident, fresh out of rotation, was about to push a dose that was wrong. Brooke saw it in the way the numbers didn't align, the math that belonged to a textbook but not to this patient. She stepped forward. Not interrupting. Not challenging. Just speaking the correction into the air like it was obvious to everyone. That's 40 milligrams too high for a patient with renal function at 22%. Her voice came out as what it was trained to be, a statement of fact, a data point, nothing personal. The attending nodded immediately. The resident's face went red. And Dr. Pierce's eyes locked onto her like a sniper finding a target. He asked her name twice during the next 2 minutes. Wrote it down in a small notebook he kept in his coat pocket. The kind of notebook men like him kept for minor irritations they planned to address later. Brooke had seen that kind of attention before, in different uniforms, in different buildings, from different men who didn't like being corrected in front of subordinates. She filed it away without reaction. The training was that good. A trauma case came in at 0905. Gunshot wound to the left flank, transfer from Grady Memorial, and with it came a combat medic from the 75th Ranger Regiment. His name was on the transfer form, Staff Sergeant Halloway, military liaison for urban trauma cases, a program the city had started 2 years ago. He was lean the way certain men became lean, the kind of leanness that came from selecting each movement, each word, each breath like ammunition was expensive. His eyes moved across the ICU like he was reading room geometry. The patient, a 19-year-old who'd been in the wrong part of Kirkwood at the wrong time, needed immediate assessment. Lines established. Flow checked. The entrance wound assessed and the trajectory estimated by someone who'd seen enough gunshot wounds to read them the way other people read books. Brooke was there because her shift had extended into the trauma, and because Dr. Pierce had stepped into the cath lab, which meant for exactly this moment, the decisions that mattered belonged to people with actual training and not just credentials on the wall. She moved to establish a second full line on the patient's right side. 14-gauge needle. The kind of precision that came from having done this under fire, under pressure, under the specific gravity of knowing that the next 15 seconds determined whether someone went home or went into a flag-draped box. The needle went in smooth. No doubt. No hesitation. The line flashed clean, and she documented the time without looking at it because she'd already measured it by heartbeats. Staff Sergeant Holloway froze mid-handoff. His hands, which had been moving in that efficient way of trained personnel, stopped. He watched her hands for 3 more seconds. That was all it took. The angle of the needle. The depth. The angle of her wrist. The specific muscle memory that belonged to someone who'd placed hundreds of these lines while the world was ending around her. He looked at her face then, really looked at her, and his expression shifted into the carefully blank stare of someone who'd just placed a chess piece and realized the board was far more complicated than he'd thought. Brooke met his eyes for exactly 1 moment. She shook her head. Not aggressively. Not a rejection. A plea. A silent instruction that said clearly, without words, do not ask me what I know. Do not ask me who I am. Keep moving. Holloway held her gaze for 3 more seconds, and then his professionalism took over. He nodded once, imperceptibly, the kind of acknowledgement that passed between soldiers without ever becoming words. He didn't ask. He continued the handoff. He prepared the patient for surgery with the kind of focus that meant he'd understood exactly what she was asking him to protect. At 1100, Brooke's secure phone buzzed inside her locker. It was military-grade encrypted, the kind of phone that didn't exist in any hospital directory. The kind of phone that only rang when command had something to tell you. She read the message in the break room, sitting on a chair that had seen 1,000 nurses collapse against its frame, and processed the information with the same flat effect she'd used since 2014. Marine General Harrison Webb. 64 years old. Vehicle accident on I-75, internal bleeding, admitted to Cedar Creek Medical for emergency trauma response and recovery. That was the cover story. The real story, the reason her team had inserted her into Cedar Creek 6 months ago under the civilian identity she'd been living in ever since, was different. General Webb's security detail had flagged a compromise. Someone inside the command structure. Someone with access. Someone poisoning him slowly, systematically, the kind of poisoning that would look like complications from internal injuries, like sepsis, like the kind of death that happened to generals in trauma bays every day and nobody asked questions because the medicine was obvious and the outcome was tragic. She was here to watch. To document. To establish evidence that could be used against an insider threat embedded in the highest levels of Marine Command. She was here as invisible support for a man whose face she'd never seen in person, whose name she knew only from briefing documents, whose life depended on her being extraordinary without ever being noticed. The phone showed no timestamp. No sender. It simply displayed the patient details and the medical record number for 47821. Webb would be in Bay 3 by 1400 hours. She was to establish post-operative protocols, monitor vital signs with special attention to suspicious fluctuations, document any abnormalities, and extract herself the moment his primary security detail arrived. Mission was clean. Mission was quiet. Mission was the kind of thing that didn't exist in writing anywhere. She deleted the message by holding the power button. The phone died without logging the deletion. She returned to the ICU at 11:15 because staying away from a patient who was about to arrive would have been more conspicuous than her usual clinical presence. Dr. Pierce was at the nurse's station. He stood too close to her, the way men like him stood close, not threatening exactly, but using proximity like a tool, taking up the air someone else was breathing. His smile came out exactly as planned, the smile of someone who'd scripted the moment. "How long have you worked here, Brooke?" He used her name like a weapon, testing its weight. "I don't think we've had much chance to talk." His voice carried the specific cadence of a man who was about to do something he'd been thinking about for 2 hours. 8 months, she said. Her voice came out exactly as it should, deferential, professional, the voice of someone who understood hierarchy and didn't challenge it. Prior nursing experience. Georgia. Community program. Rural hospital. All of it was true. All of it was also a lie constructed so carefully that anyone who checked would find exactly what they were supposed to find. He nodded, and his eyes moved across her face in a way that suggested he was cataloging details for later use. "Well, just make sure you stay within your scope. I'd hate to see someone with your initiative get confused about the boundaries of nursing practice." He said it like a warning wrapped in mentorship. Like he was helping her understand something she didn't know she needed to understand. Then he walked away, already pulling his phone from his coat pocket, his thumb already moving toward his contacts list. The room went dead silent. That silence meant something. Brooke had learned to read silence the way other people read words, and this silence had weight. This silence had intention. This silence said that something had just shifted, and the game she'd been playing invisible had suddenly developed an opponent who'd finally noticed her moving pieces. She had no idea what Pierce was about to do, but she knew what she'd just witnessed. A man seeing someone he didn't understand occupying space in his hospital, correcting his errors, moving through his ICU with a competence that outpaced his credentials, and deciding that couldn't continue. At 13:47, General Harrison Webb was wheeled into Bay 3. And everything Brooke Sullivan had been in her other life, before the scrubs and the civilian documentation and the careful invisibility, was about to become relevant again. Thursday morning arrived like a wound reopening. The fluorescent lights of Cedar Creek Medical's conference room hummed their sterile song as Brooke slipped into the back corner, arms crossed, shoulders against the cold drywall. Grand rounds. 20 residents, 6 attendings, 1 departmental director who'd already decided nothing she said would matter. Dr. Pierce stood at the podium like a man who'd never lost an argument in his life, and maybe he hadn't. His tie cost more than her rent. His watch caught the light like a weapon. The projector clicked. Her charting filled the screen in massive red text, specific passages circled in crimson marker like a crime scene photo. Cranial nerve function assessment. Trending lab interpretation. Medication adjustment recommendation. This, Pierce announced, his voice smooth as expensive whiskey, is what happens when nurses forget their scope of practice. He let the words hang like smoke. Nurse Sullivan here believes she's qualified to perform clinical diagnoses. Notice the documentation, cranial nerve function, interpreted lab trends, even suggested medication adjustments. He turned to the residents, eyebrows raised. All without an MD. The smirking started. Brooke had been smirked at by people holding actual guns. This was different. This was the smirk of people who'd never had to choose between being right and being alive. An attending shifted his weight, uncomfortable. The departmental director took notes. "We have protocols," Pierce continued, clicking to another slide. Her name in bold. Her assessment in bold. Protocols exist because they save lives. Nurses observe. Doctors diagnose. When Nurse Nightingale here decides to play doctor, he paused for laughter that didn't come. Patients die. The final slide, example of nursing overreach. A header. Her face, pulled from the employee database. Her credentials, summarized in dismissive bullet points. Brooke's expression didn't shift. Her breathing stayed level. Her eye stayed flat, the kind of flat that comes from standing watch at 0300 in Kandahar while mortar rounds walked up the perimeter, from holding a field thoracotomy with a combat knife while rounds snapped overhead, from compartmentalizing things that would break normal people into powder. Pierce dismissed the group at 0930. By 1100, he'd already called board member Harrison. By 11:45, he was standing outside the Georgia Nursing Program Director's office via phone, asking pointed questions about a Brooke Sullivan, barely attended, minimal clinical rotations, how did she even graduate? The vending machine on the second floor was her mistake. She needed coffee, but the vending machine became a stage the moment Pierce saw her there alone. 2 other nurses were within earshot. A resident too, pretending to be absorbed in his phone. Pierce moved like a shark sensing blood in the water. Sullivan. Not a greeting. A collision. Dr. Pierce. She was inserting her dollar bill when he spoke, voice loud enough to carry down the hallway. I've been reviewing your credentials. His voice had that particular quality now, the voice of a man who'd found a weakness and intended to exploit it. Georgia Nursing Program, barely attended, minimal clinical rotations. Yet here you are in my ICU, acting like you run the place. She didn't turn around. She finished selecting her coffee. The machine hummed its mechanical acknowledgement. Let me be crystal clear. He stepped closer. His cologne was expensive and suffocating, the scent of someone who'd never been close enough to death to understand what really mattered. If you ever question my orders again, if you ever practice medicine without supervision, I will have security escort you out of this hospital in handcuffs. Playing doctor doesn't just cost licenses, Sullivan. It costs lives. The resident grinned. The other nurses stared at their feet, not because they were afraid of Pierce, but because they didn't know what to do with a moment like this. A moment where authority was being weaponized not against crime or incompetence, but against someone who'd been right. When Pierce finally stopped talking, when he stood there breathing hard, when he was clearly waiting for tears or apologies or some kind of break, Brooke turned toward him. The coffee cup was warm in her hands. Her voice came out calm as a surgical suite at 0600. Strange how your mistakes only happen on my days off. She didn't wait for his response. She walked past him, down the hallway, her footsteps clicking against tile in a rhythm that sounded like inevitability. Behind her, she felt him flushing purple, felt his hands trembling with a rage that had no healthy outlet. She could hear his breathing change, the breathing of a man whose control had just been publicly questioned. By 1400 that afternoon, a sticky note appeared on her locker, Nurse Nightingale, stay in your lane. The handwriting was Pierce's, expensive and furious. But that wasn't the worst part. What she didn't know yet was that Pierce had already begun his systematic dismantling. Thursday evening, he summoned an external hospital investigator from the State Medical Board, hand-delivered 6 months of her charts with post-it flags marking concerns. The investigator, a woman named Dr. Reeves who'd never worked in combat medicine or undercover assignments, would review every assessment Brooke had documented, every clinical judgment she'd made, every moment she'd been exactly right but technically outside her lane. By Friday morning, the external review was official. By Saturday, the Georgia Nursing Program Director called confirming minimal rotations. By Sunday, board member Harrison was calling Pierce asking when this dangerous situation would be resolved. Brooke learned about the investigation Monday morning when her supervisor, a woman named Janet who actually respected her work, pulled her into a private office with the kind of expression that meant bad news traveling at administrative speed. There's an external review, Janet said quietly. 6-month chart audit. State Medical Board. They're questioning your scope of practice. Janet's hands were shaking slightly. She knew what this meant. An external review meant the hospital was preparing for litigation. An external review meant someone in administration was already assuming the nurse had done something wrong. How long? Brooke asked. 2 weeks minimum. Possibly longer. They want to talk to you Wednesday. 2 weeks. The general was arriving Tuesday. The room felt smaller. The walls felt closer. Not because she was scared, fear was a luxury for people who had something left to lose, but because she could see the timeline collapsing. Mission: monitor the general for poisoning threats. Mission: gather evidence of insider attack. Mission: remain invisible. Instead, her name was about to be in every report. Her face was about to be in every investigation file. Her cover was about to be shredded like classified documents in a burn bag. She met her handler in the parking garage at 0200 Monday morning, in a grey sedan with Virginia plates, with a Marine intelligence officer named Captain Graves who had the voice of someone who'd sent people into situations worse than this and lived with it. The general arrives Tuesday, 1400, Graves said, handing her a folder, real documents, the kind you could never bring into a hospital. Vehicle accident overseas, officially. Complications from internal injuries. He'll go to recovery under his civilian name, Robert Harrison, will request minimal visitors, will be expecting you. There's an investigation, Brooke said flatly. External review. 6 months of charts. They're questioning my scope of practice. Graves was quiet. The kind of quiet that meant he was running calculations in his head, running probabilities. Can you hold? 72 hours. Minimum. She nodded once. They both knew what she was signing up for. She nodded and Graves handed her a burner phone, old technology, secure, the kind used in actual intelligence work, and a single card with a number on it. You get made, you call this. We extract you Thursday 0600, with or without the general. And if I'm in the middle of something? You call anyway, Graves said, and she understood. The mission was never more important than the operator. That was Marine code. That was what separated them from the people who sent soldiers into burning houses and then rewrote the reports. She didn't call. Not yet. Tuesday morning arrived bright and violent, the kind of Atlanta heat that made the parking lot shimmer like a mirage. Brooke had barely slept. She'd spent the night reviewing the general's medical file, the vehicle accident report, the preliminary toxicology. No signs of direct poisoning. No obvious insider threat markers. But the threat was there. The handler wouldn't have embedded her for nothing. The threat was always there. The ranger medic appeared at 11:30 during her shift, setting down a patient file at the nurse's station with the casual precision of someone who'd practiced the movement 1,000 times. He was smaller than she remembered from Act 1, the kind of lean that came from carrying things that weighed more than muscle. He didn't look at her directly. He never looked at her directly. That was part of the code. But he spoke quietly enough that only she could hear, his voice like gravel in a metal can, his words specific and surgical. I served with a combat surgeon in Kandahar. Watched her decompress her chest in 30 seconds during a firefight. She moved exactly like you move. The room didn't go silent. The coffee maker didn't stop humming. But something in the space between Brooke and the medic changed pressure, the way air changes pressure before a storm. Brooke met his eyes once. Once was enough. She shook her head, a small motion, barely perceptible, a silent plea, don't see me. Don't know me. Don't make this harder. The medic understood. He stepped back, picked up his clipboard, walked away. But the recognition burned between them like a live wire, and Brooke realized that her invisible years, the years of being just a nurse, just a civilian with a stethoscope and a false name, were already beginning to collapse. At 13:47, the ER admissions board updated. New patient, Harrison, Robert. Marine General, civilian status. ETA 1400. Vehicle accident complications. Brooke checked the clock, 13:54. The countdown had begun. The clock on the ICU wall read 13:54 when the ambulance bay doors burst open. Brooke heard it first, the radio chatter, the urgency code cutting through the afternoon hum of Cedar Creek Medical, the kind of tone that meant someone was bleeding out. She was 3 feet from Bay 3 when the paramedics wheeled the stretcher through, the patient covered in field dressings already soaked through, his blood the color of old pennies. The intake sheet read MVA, blunt force trauma, internal bleeding suspected, but Brooke's eyes found the patient's face and her entire body went cold. It was him. Marine General Webb. Her asset. The man she'd been assigned to protect. The paramedic rattled off vitals like he was reading a grocery list: BP 98/62 and dropping, heart rate 142, respiratory rate 28, GCS 13, ETA to surgery is 12 minutes if we beat traffic. The general's eyes were open but unfocused, his breathing shallow and rapid, his skin the pale grey-white of someone whose blood volume was hemorrhaging away faster than his heart could pump it back. Brooke had seen this pattern before, not in a hospital, but in a phi base outside Kandahar, bleeding soldiers on stretchers who made it or didn't depending on whether someone who knew what they were doing got there in time. They transferred him to Bay 3. Hospital protocol demanded she step back, let the trauma team take over, maintain the invisible boundary between nurse and command. But Brooke was already moving, already assessing, already reading the monitors with the part of her brain that had spent 14 months running a surgical unit under fire. The bleeding wasn't slowing. In fact, the rate of pressure drop suggested something worse than simple trauma. The fluid resuscitation wasn't holding. His hematocrit was crashing. The pattern of coagulopathy, the way his body was fighting the blood they were pouring in, anticoagulant. Someone had poisoned him. Someone had led a poison under the accident to make sure the trauma alone wouldn't kill him. The poison would finish the work by preventing his blood from clotting. The intelligence brief flashed in her memory: subject may encounter targeted anticoagulation delivery mechanism consistent with insider threat. She'd read it 3 times. This was the threat. This was the mission. Dr. Pierce swept into Bay 3 like he owned it, his white coat moving like a sail, his voice pitched to carry authority. 2 units O negative, stat. Increase pressures to 0.2 micrograms per kilogram per minute. Get me a trauma surgeon down here. And someone get me a CT, I want to know what we're dealing with before we crack him open. His hands moved through the air like a conductor directing an orchestra, each gesture a command, each sentence layered with the casual certainty of someone who'd never been wrong because he'd never let anyone contradict him. Brooke stepped to the monitor and read the numbers. BP dropping, 94 now. 91, O2 sat 89 and still falling. The trauma surgeon, a resident named Kemp, maybe 30 years old, definitely not old enough for this, arrived looking like he'd been pulled from somewhere safer. His hands were shaking. She could see it from across the room, the slight tremor in his fingers as he reached for the patient, as he tried to make sense of the chaos. Young doctors always trembled when they saw someone dying. Experienced ones moved like machines. Get him typed and crossed for 6 units, Pierce barked at the blood bank nurse, then spun toward the monitors. What's his O2 sat? Someone said 85. Pierce nodded, satisfied. Then we'll sedate him pre-arrival to the OR. Get me succinylcholine, 100 milligrams for push. We'll intubate him and scan his abdomen. I want images before surgery. Brooke did the math in her head the way her former commanding officer, Colonel Davies, had taught her: vital signs as equations, time as currency, every second weighted against survival probability. The general had maybe 3 minutes before his blood pressure hit 60 systolic. The OR was 12 minutes away. A CT scan would add another 8 to 10 minutes of immobility, 8 to 10 more minutes of bleeding out. She ran the numbers twice, knew she was right the first time, understood with the cold clarity of someone who'd made these calculations under mortar fire that the CT would kill him. The monitors began their frantic song. Blood pressure 88/55. Heart rate 158, the rhythm starting to look irregular, the electrical system of his heart beginning to fail. The nurse running fluids was pale, competent, doing everything right, and none of it was working because nothing would work if they didn't address the bleeding. Brooke moved closer to the bedside. The general's eyes were still open, still conscious, still aware enough to know something was wrong. She met his gaze for just a fraction of a second and saw recognition flicker, the moment he realized she wasn't just a nurse, the moment his training caught up with his injury. She shook her head once, a single gesture. Wait. Trust me. Problem, Nurse Nightingale. Pierce's voice cut across the room like a blade. He'd given her the nickname in front of the residents during his grand rounds humiliation, dragging out the Victorian reference, making it an insult. Nightingale. Something delicate, something that belonged in a pretty painting, something that had no place in an ICU making real decisions. She didn't answer. She just watched the monitors. BP 86/52. The general's blood pressure was bottoming out. The trauma surgeon was checking the abdomen again, his hands moving with less confidence, the tremor getting worse. Pierce was still talking about the CT scan, about getting images, about maintaining protocol. Protocol would kill him. "We need to crack his chest," Brooke said. Her voice came out low, level, the kind of voice that didn't ask permission. "Now." The room stopped. Everyone turned. Pierce's face shifted through 5 emotions in 4 seconds: surprise, offense, fury, and then something else, something that looked like rage. "You do not give orders in my ICU," he said, and each word came out measured, controlled, the way a man speaks when he's trying very hard not to yell. "You are a nurse. You follow instructions. You do not make clinical decisions. You do not interrupt my treatment protocol." He stepped toward her, his body language a wall. "If you question one more of my orders, I will have security escort you out of this hospital. Do you understand me?" The general's monitor alarm screamed. BP 78/48. The rhythm on the screen was deteriorating, the electrical chaos of a heart running out of blood. This was the moment. This was the choice that would break everything. She could stay silent, stay invisible, maintain her cover, let the mission proceed while her patient died of a poison she'd been assigned to help him survive. Or she could step forward. She could take command. She could blow 14 months of careful preparation in 6 seconds. She thought of Kandahar. She thought of soldiers on stretchers. She thought of the Phi base where she'd learned that orders don't matter when someone is bleeding out in front of you, only skill matters, only the knowledge that lives on the other side of your hands. Brooke moved past Dr. Pierce. Not around him. Past him. She moved like someone who had no obstacles, like the laws of hierarchy didn't apply to her, like his rank meant nothing against her competence. "Scalpel," she said. Her voice had changed. It was her captain's voice, the one she'd buried under 14 months of deference, the one that had commanded surgical teams under sustained fire. "Rib spreader. Arterial clamp. Move." The room responded. The trauma resident grabbed the instruments. A nurse was already opening the thoracotomy tray. No one questioned. No one hesitated. They heard the command and they obeyed, because command sounds a certain way and the human nervous system recognizes it without conscious thought. Pierce was moving toward her, his mouth open, rage replacing everything else on his face, but she was already prepping the site, already moving with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd done this 14 times before, in tents and caves and rubble-strewn streets with bullets coming closer every minute. The scalpel was already in her hand. The incision was already starting, clean and deep between the 4th and 5th ribs, the technique muscle memory from 10,000 hours of practice. The bleeding was immediate, the general was losing too much fluid, his blood pressure almost non-existent, but the moment she had access to the thoracic cavity and could see the source, she could control it. Dr. Pierce stood 3 feet away, his voice rising, shouting something about her license, about calling security, but his words were just noise now. Brooke had moved into a space beyond hearing, beyond caring, into the place where nothing existed except the bleeding and her hands and the desperate arithmetic of saving a life. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was realizing, as she worked, as she clamped the internal bleeding with precision and applied pressure with her gloved hands, that somewhere in the hospital, in an office 3 floors above, someone was making phone calls. Someone was documenting this moment. Someone was building a case that would destroy her the moment this patient's heart started beating again. Because saving him had just cost her everything. The ambulance arrived at Cedar Creek Medical at 1,342 hours on a Tuesday, siren cutting through Atlanta traffic like a blade through silk. The bay doors burst open. A Marine general, 73 years old, bleeding internally from a vehicle accident on I-85, was wheeled in on a stretcher, his vitals already dropping into the red. Systolic pressure 68 and falling. O2 sat 74. The trauma team scattered like startled birds. Brooke stood at the monitor station when the call came through. She didn't move. Not yet. She'd trained herself to wait, to watch, to let the civilian physicians play their game until the moment her hands became necessary. The general's chart scrolled across the screen: blunt force trauma, spleen possibly ruptured, internal bleeding rate accelerating. 3 units of ONEG already hanging. Not enough. Not nearly enough. The trauma surgeon, a competent man named Holloway with steady hands on good days, rushed into the ICU bay. This was not a good day. His hands were already shaking. Brooke could see it from 30 feet away, the slight tremor as he reached for the ultrasound probe. Fear. He'd seen the vitals. He knew this was already triage territory. Dr. Pierce arrived 60 seconds later, moving with the deliberate authority of a man who'd never lost an argument because he'd never admitted doubt. He saw the general, saw the monitors, saw Holloway's trembling fingers, and immediately began barking orders that contradicted each other like he was conducting an orchestra only he could hear. Push another unit of FFP, no, wait, hold the transfusion, we need imaging first. Get CT down here now. Actually, he's too unstable for CT, prep for surgery. His voice like a tank idling in a garage, all power, no direction. The general's pressure dropped to 62. Holloway looked at Pierce. Pierce looked back with the confidence of a man who'd never actually performed an emergency thoracotomy in his life. The general's O2 sat cratered to 68. His heart rate climbed past 140, searching desperately for perfusion that wasn't there. The rhythm looked good, still sinus, still organized, but the body was shutting down. 40 seconds until cardiac arrest if the bleeding wasn't controlled. Brooke moved before she finished the thought. She didn't ask. She didn't request. She walked past both physicians like they were furniture, pulled a scalpel from the crash cart with her left hand, and made the first incision in one smooth horizontal cut across the general's fourth intercostal space. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. No sterile field. No anesthesia team. No time for any of it. Just combat-trained muscle memory taking the wheel. "Retractor," she said. Not a question. A command in the voice of someone who'd issued them under mortar fire. Holloway handed it over like he'd been waiting his entire career to be ordered around by a nurse. Brooke opened the chest cavity, the ribs spreading like pages of a book. The lung came into view, dark and heavy. She found the spleen 3 inches deeper, a dark mass bleeding into the peritoneal space, vessels torn open like a broken water main. Her hands moved on their own. Fingers finding the bleeders without hesitation. A surgical clamp went on first. Then a second. The pressure stabilized almost immediately. O2 sat 72. 76, 81. Climbing. 40 seconds. She'd controlled the bleed in 40 seconds with a technique that required either extensive surgical training or extensive combat training. She had one of those. Not the legal kind. The room went silent. Not the quiet of respect. The quiet of people watching something impossible happen in real time. Holloway stared. The respiratory tech froze mid-breath. A 75th Ranger Regiment combat medic, the same one who'd watched her work the trauma case weeks ago, stood in the doorway with his hands gone slack, and quietly said to the nurse beside him, "That's not civilian technique. That's pure Kandahar." Pierce recovered first. His face flushed red, not from relief, but from rage. A nurse, a woman without his degree, without his credentials, without permission, had just performed emergency surgery while he stood there issuing contradictory orders. The general's pressure was now 94 systolic and stable. The oxygen was climbing toward normal. And Pierce's entire worldview had just cracked open. He didn't stay in the bay. He walked out instead, jaw clenched, eyes hot with calculation. Brooke could feel the moment he started counting his moves like a chess player seeing 3 moves ahead. She'd just handed him everything he needed. By 1400 hours, Pierce had made his first call to board member Harrison, a man he'd met at the Piedmont Driving Club. By 1445, he'd called the state investigator who was already building her file. By 1530, he'd summoned the hospital's chief of staff and delivered his narrative in careful, measured tones. A nurse had performed an authorized surgery. A nurse had violated every protocol, every safety regulation, every boundary between nursing and medicine. A nurse was practicing medicine without a license in his hospital, and he had dozens of witnesses. The language was perfect. The tone was reasonable. The facts were technically true. Brooke was summoned to administration at 1845 hours. Her badge was suspended pending investigation, effective immediately. Chief of Staff mentioned words like legal liability and state board review and criminal prosecution with the calm of a man reading a menu. She didn't argue. Didn't cry. Didn't tremble. She listened to the entire sentence, then nodded once and walked out. Her phone buzzed at 1903. The message was coded but clear, extraction 0600. Her handler was already in motion. The mission was blown. The cover was shattered. 12 hours to disappear. At midnight, Brooke walked into the hospital laundry room. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like dying insects. The room smelled like bleach and hot cotton and the residue of other people's emergencies. She pulled her scrubs from her locker, the blue one she'd worn for 6 months, the ones that had hidden everything, and began folding them with the same precision she'd used to close the general's chest cavity. Fold. Crease. Place. The movements were automatic. She hadn't found the poisoner. The surveillance was incomplete. The mission was a failure by every operational standard. But she'd saved a life. A Marine general would wake up tomorrow because she'd made a choice in 40 seconds. And now she was walking away with nothing, no clearance, no badge, no explanation to anyone who mattered. The unit patch inside her jacket lining caught her eye as she moved. 2nd Marine Expeditionary Force. Kandahar Province. The faded fabric held her call sign, her rank, the 14 months she'd spent keeping wounded Marines alive in a phi base where the perimeter got overrun 3 times. She touched it once, feeling the texture of cloth that had survived things the world wasn't supposed to know about. She left the scrubs folded in a perfect rectangle on top of the hamper. No note. No explanation. Just a civilian walking out of a hospital at midnight in jeans and a jacket, the automatic doors closing behind her like a coffin lid, severing the last connection to a life that had never really existed anyway. The extraction would come at dawn. She would go back to being nobody, nothing, a ghost with paperwork at some black site operation that didn't have a name. And somewhere in a hospital bed upstairs, a Marine general who owed her his life would wake up and look for the only person in Cedar Creek Medical who had ever actually been trained to save him. She made it to the parking lot. Got to her car. Had her hand on the door handle when her phone rang. Unknown number. Not her handler. Not anyone in her network. She answered because people who don't answer calls in the middle of the night tend to attract attention, and she needed to be invisible for 6 more hours. Captain Sullivan. A man's voice, military bearing already evident in those 2 words. My name is Colonel James Mercer. I'm calling about your patient. General Webb just woke up. The general woke at 0400 hours with Brooke standing final watch beside monitors she no longer had clearance to read. The ICU had gone quiet in that particular way that comes just before dawn. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, the 4 pumps ticked in metered succession, and the cardiac monitor traced a steady sinus rhythm across the screen. His eyes moved first, searching the darkness, then focused. And there, on the inner lining of her jacket draped across the chair beside his bed, he saw it. A faded unit patch. 2nd Marine Expeditionary Force. Kandahar. The insignia worn soft at the edges, still crisp enough to read if you knew what you were looking at. His lips moved. 1 word. Barely a whisper. Valkyrie. Brooke didn't flinch. Didn't move. She simply met his eyes once, the way she'd been trained to do across 5 base perimeters in Helmand Province, across surgical tables where the difference between steady hands and shaking ones meant the lives of 17 Marines in a single 72-hour rotation. That look said everything her orders forbade her mouth to speak. The general closed his eyes and nodded, a soldier understanding the silence of a fellow soldier. The nod of someone who recognized the price of the gift they'd just been given. An hour passed. The dawn didn't break so much as creep across the ICU windows like water seeping under a door. At 0515, boots on tile. 2 officers entered, dressed in dress blues so sharp they looked like they could cut. The first was a Marine Colonel, Mercer, his insignia reading like a benediction to anyone who knew how to read military rank. Behind him, a 2-star general in service dress uniform, ribbons arranged in descending rows, each one a story of command and consequence. The general's intelligence officer followed, tablet under one arm, jaw set like a man walking into a firing squad with his head high. The colonel approached Brooke's patient. His voice dropped into the clinical register of someone delivering a medical briefing, but each word carried the weight of ceremony. "Sir, we're here to inform you that the threat assessment is complete. Cedar Creek Medical will be transitioning your care to Walter Reed Army Medical Center effective this evening. Your protection detail will remain in place through transition." He paused. Then the words came. Not as military bureaucracy. As recognition. Captain Brooke Sullivan, Navy Cross recipient. Silver Star. 2 Purple Hearts for combat wounds sustained while maintaining a surgical unit under sustained fire resulting in 0 preventable deaths over 14 months of continuous operations in Kandahar. The colonel's eye shifted to Brooke once. You were classified as killed in action. Then reclassified as embedded. Then disappeared from every database the Pentagon maintains. The 2-star general moved toward the wall where Brooke's jacket hung. He lifted it. Found the storage locker beside the bed, the locker where she'd hidden ribbons she'd earned 14 years ago and never worn again. Her service dress uniform folded beneath old paperbacks and a framed photograph of a 5 base in winter. The general opened the locker and removed the decorations. One by one, he turned to face the growing crowd gathering in the ICU, nurses who'd worked beside Brooke for 6 weeks, residents who'd watched her move with precision they'd never quite understood, the attending physicians now realizing what they'd been looking at all along. The general raised his right hand and saluted. Not a casual gesture. A full ceremonial salute, held for the prescribed count, held until every eye in the ICU understood that this woman in scrubs had worn captain's bars in deserts they couldn't fathom. Dr. Pierce pushed through the gathering. His face had gone the color of old newsprint. His voice came out cracked, desperate, the voice of a man watching the architecture of his authority crumble in real time. Her military service doesn't excuse practicing medicine without a license. That's not how our system works. I don't care if she's Dr. Pierce. The colonel's voice was quiet. Clinical. Absolute. You need to stop talking. But Pierce kept talking. The words tumbled out like water from a broken dam. He talked about protocol violations and scope of practice and the board review he'd initiated, and his voice grew higher with each sentence until it cracked entirely. Someone had to maintain standards. Someone had to. The IT director stepped forward. His name was Chen. He wore a Navy veteran pin on his lanyard. In his hands was a USB drive, small enough to vanish in a closed fist, heavy enough to end careers. We need to talk about standards, Chen said quietly. He handed the drive to the chief of staff. This contains 8 weeks of security footage from the hospital network. I preserved it all. Every frame. The chief of staff opened his laptop. The ICU had gone completely silent now. The kind of silence that happens in operating rooms when a monitor flatlines. The kind of silence that happens in military tents when orders come down that no one expected. On the screen, timestamps. Dates. Dr. Pierce in his office late at night, deleting files from patient records. Altering medication administration times. falsifying report dates to cover outcomes he'd caused. 8 weeks of evidence compressed into pixel-perfect digital proof of a man erasing his own failures one keystroke at a time. Chen spoke loudly enough for the whole gathering to hear. He tried to wipe the entire server last night, starting at 2,247 hours. When Captain Sullivan's badge got pulled, he panicked. Tried again 2 minutes ago from his tablet. Chen checked his phone. The deletion attempt is logged. I have the timestamp. I have the server access logs. I have every keystroke. Dr. Pierce's face went from white to a shade of red that looked dangerous. His hand moved toward his phone. His fingers shook. He pulled up the hospital network on his tablet, desperate, frantic, trying one more time to delete the evidence that would destroy him. Chen stepped closer. Watched him do it. Made a note on his own phone. Timestamp 05 for 6 hours. A man destroying his career in real time, witnessed, documented, irrevocable. A board member, Harrison, physically stepped backward. Away from Pierce. The movement was small but unmistakable. In hospital politics, that backward step was a declaration. The distance between institutional protection and personal survival crossed in a single meter. The state investigator Pierce had summoned stood in the doorway, holding the file Pierce had requested be opened on Brooke. But Chen's drive was in the chief of staff's hands now, and the investigator's eyes were moving across the laptop screen with the expression of someone watching a man drown in his own office. Security moved toward Pierce. Not aggressively. Just with purpose. The way security moves when a decision has been made above everyone's pay grade. The general's intelligence officer stepped into the center of the ICU. He spoke with the voice of someone accustomed to command and silence. Captain Sullivan was embedded at Cedar Creek Medical on a classified operation under JSOC oversight. Her mission: investigate a hospital opioid diversion ring with possible connection to the compromise of Marine General Webb's security perimeter overseas. The poisoning of General Webb was not accidental. Anticoagulants were administered in Landstuhl Army Medical Center by a contractor with financial ties to a pharmacy technician at Cedar Creek Medical. That technician is currently in federal custody. The pharmaceutical theft network spans 3 states and 2 military installations. Captain Sullivan's cover as a civilian nurse was necessary for operational security. Her emergency intervention saved the general's life and provided evidence that broke the investigation wide open. The general nodded once at Brooke. Valkyrie Actual. The call sign that meant you were the last thing standing between your people and oblivion. Her extraction has been reclassified, the intelligence officer continued. She's being removed from Cedar Creek Medical effective immediately and will return to active duty status. Her medical license will be fully restored by close of business today. The board review initiated by Dr. Pierce will be dismissed as baseless and expunged from her personnel file. Pierce was being escorted toward the exit. His protests had stopped. His mouth opened and closed with the expression of someone trying to remember how words worked. The hospital security officers were polite about it. Professional. But absolute. The door closed behind him with a kind of finality that sounded like a cell locking. 6 months later, Dr. Pierce stood in front of a community college classroom in the Atlanta suburbs, wearing a short-sleeved polo shirt with a community college logo, teaching CPR fundamentals to insurance adjusters and bank tellers who'd rather have been anywhere else. His pay was $18 an hour. His medical license was suspended. His name had been forwarded to the state medical board with a recommendation for permanent revocation pending criminal trial for falsifying patient records and obstruction of justice. The hospital had placed his photo in the compliance office as a cautionary tale, a headshot with a single caption underneath, "What happens when ego overrides patient care?" Board member Harrison had resigned within a week. The pharmacy technician who diverted medications had been convicted on federal charges. The contractor who'd poisoned the general was fighting extradition from Mexico. But in the Pentagon, in a ceremony held in the Hall of Heroes on a Thursday afternoon, something different was happening. Brooke stood in Class A uniform. The dress blues that belonged to captains who'd earned the right to wear them in daylight. Her ribbons were arranged in descending rows of prestige, each one a different color, each one a story that had taken 14 years to tell. Bronze Star, Silver Star, 2 Purple Hearts, and a Navy Cross, the highest decoration for valor her branch could bestow. The Secretary of Defense approached. She was a woman with gray threading through her hair and eyes that had seen every kind of warfare. She shook Brooke's hand. Her grip was firm. Her words were audible to the assembled crowd of generals and admirals and politicians who'd come to witness whatever this was. Captain Sullivan, your service in the shadows exemplifies a principle that most people never understand. The opioid diversion network you exposed was responsible for medication theft across 14 hospitals and 3 military installations. Your embedded operation resulted in the recovery of 147,000 doses of controlled substances and the prosecution of 12 individuals involved in the conspiracy. More importantly, your presence at Cedar Creek Medical during the General's medical crisis allowed us to identify and neutralize a threat to his life that would have gone undetected through normal security channels. The Secretary paused. Her eyes held Brooke's. You saved 40 lives. You did it in scrubs. You did it in silence. And you did it when no one was watching. True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching. The room filled with applause. It was the kind of applause that comes from people who understand what they've just witnessed. The Ranger medic from Cedar Creek Medical stood in the 3rd row, finally allowed to salute her openly. The General, recovered fully, in a dress uniform that fit him the way uniforms fit men who've earned them, shook her hand. Valkyrie Actual, he said quietly. Welcome home. Brooke walked through the Pentagon corridors afterward in her Class A uniform. The fluorescent lights were the same as they'd always been, but somehow different now. She passed officers and enlisted personnel who didn't know who she was but saluted her rank anyway, each salute a small acknowledgement of the distance between who she'd been and who she was now. No scrubs. No disguise. No faded patch hidden in a jacket lining because she wasn't allowed to show it. That patch was framed now. On her desk. 2nd Marine Expeditionary Force, Kandahar. The identity she'd carried in secret for 14 years, finally earned the right to wear in daylight. She touched it once as she sat down. The faded colors caught the afternoon light filtering through the Pentagon windows. Outside, the rain hammered the pavement like applause, like recognition finally arriving after the long silence. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who had power but not wisdom, subscribe. If you know someone like Brooke, someone strong in the quiet way that matters, comment her name. Like this video. And let us know, what would you have done in her position?